Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to take a look again at Descartes' argument for dualism and see if we can raise any challenges to the reasoning that led him to that conclusion. So in this video, we'll review his disembodiment argument, then we'll look at two challenges, one that appeals to the connection between conceivability and possibility, and another one that appeals to questions about confused ideas. So Descartes' defense of dualism goes as follows. He says, look, we can at least conceive of a situation where our mind exists without our physical body or without our brain. But then if we're able to conceive of that situation, then that's at least possible. Thus, it's at least possible for our mind to exist without our physical body. But if our mind and body were just the same thing, then this would be impossible. Thus, since it is possible, the mind and the body must be two distinct things with two distinct natures or essences. One problem for this argument is that conceivability is not always a good test of possibility. So I can give you a couple examples to illustrate this. Consider the story of Superman. Imagine a character in the Superman universe before they know that Clark Kent is Superman. Well, Lois Lane, if I ask her, she might say that she's able to imagine or conceive of a world where Superman exists but Clark Kent doesn't. But the fact that she can conceive of or imagine such a world doesn't show that it's possible. She's only able to imagine that because she doesn't realize that Superman is in fact the same person as Clark Kent. So, a student in math class who hasn't yet been given a proof of the Pythagorean theorem may claim that they can conceive of a right triangle where the square of its hypotenuse is not equal to the square of its two other sides. So even though they say that they can conceive of this, it looks as if that doesn't show that it's really possible. Or a person back in, say, 1700, back in Descartes' time, might have claimed to be able to conceive of a situation where water turned out to be composed of 3 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen rather than H2O. However, even though they might have been able to imagine such a situation, it wasn't really possible because, as it turned out, water and H2O are exactly the same thing. So this shows that not everything we can conceive of are really genuine possibilities. And so maybe our ability to conceive of the mind without the body doesn't show that it's really possible. Maybe it's like Lois Lane's imagining Superman without Clark Kent. Maybe we're only able to imagine that because we are ignorant of sort of the physical aspect of the mind. So sometimes these things only seem possible due to our own ignorance. So Descartes did have a reply to this challenge. He says, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other, at least by God. And so Descartes is appealing to his clear and distinct rule in this sort of divine guarantee. He says, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly perceive something shows that it is true. So the fact that I can clearly and distinctly perceive of the separability of mind and body, he thinks, guarantees that they are in fact separable. At least God would have the power to do so. Now, you don't necessarily have to appeal to the power of God in order to try to make this sort of case. But Descartes' idea is that the conceivability test seems to be good when our ideas of the things involved are complete and adequate or clear and distinct, when the ideas are not confused. So in the previous cases, notice the person is only able to conceive of an impossible situation because they have a limited, unclear, or confused idea. So Lois Lane did not have a complete idea of Clark Kent or Superman. So Clark Kent sometimes goes into phone booths and puts on Superman clothes. Lois Lane didn't know that. So she had a limited sort of understanding, a limited idea of Clark Kent. Similarly, the student, insofar as they were ignorant of the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, they had a limited understanding of right triangles. They had a confused, unclear idea of right triangles. And that's why they were able to imagine. If they had a fuller, more clear idea, they wouldn't have been able to conceive of a right triangle where its square of its hypotenuse didn't add up to the square of the other two sides. Similarly, back in the 1700s, the person who was able to conceive of sort of water turning out to be H3O rather than H2O, they were able to conceive of that because they were just missing information. They didn't have a clear sort of idea of water yet. This raises another problem. Maybe we actually have a limited or confused concept of the mind and body. And maybe our ability to imagine the one without the other is not because this is really possible, but just because, like Lois Lane and Superman, we have a confused idea of the mind. We're sort of ignorant of various aspects of the mind. So even if we accept Descartes' claim that when we have a clear and distinct perception, it'll be true, there's a further question of, can we know that we are actually having a clear and distinct perception? So how do we know that we aren't just having a confused and obscure perception of our mind that we mistakenly think is a clear and distinct perception? So sometimes I have students that tell me that they are able to imagine or conceive of a round square. And I say, no, you can't. They say, what are you talking about? I'm doing it right now. I'm imagining a round square right now. It's clearly right there. And then I draw a picture of a I take what's like a square and then I just sort of round the corners out. And I say, is this what you're imagining? And usually they say, well, yeah. I say, well, that's not a round square that you're imagining. That's something that's kind of like a square, but not actually a square, since it doesn't meet the definition of a square. It's similar to a circle, but it's not a circle because it doesn't meet the definition of a circle either. And so the reason they thought they could sort of imagine a round square, they thought they had a clear conception of it, but in fact they had a confused conception of it. So similarly, how do we know that we don't just think that we have a clear concept of the mind and of the body, even though we're sort of missing some information? And so when we look back at Descartes' argument, the first worry is that premise 2 looks false. It looks as if we have these examples of people conceiving of a situation that turned out not to be possible. Then Descartes tries to fix the argument by saying, well, look, we can clearly and distinctly conceive of a situation where our mind exists without our physical body. And even if not everything we can conceive of is possible, everything we can clearly and distinctly conceive of is possible. But now the problem becomes, how do we know that premise 1 is true? How do we know that we're actually having a clear and distinct conception of the mind and the body when we imagine the one without the other? Maybe we're just working with a confused, limited notion here. So that discussion of Descartes' mind-body dualism is going to wrap up our discussion of Descartes' meditations. I'll see you next time.